What if I told you that there's only one way to learn a language that most people don't understand, causing them to waste hundreds of hours never actually getting fluent? But once you understand this one core principle, you'll be able to learn any language you want without issues. So in this video, I'll explain how it works, the pros and cons of it, as well as exactly how to implement it to reach your specific language learning goals. So let me show you what I'm talking about. This little guy here is Yu, and he's tried a bunch of different methods to learn languages, but none of them are really sticking, and he's not making very good progress. Now this is due to one key component that is missing, and without it, it's like putting fuel in a car that doesn't even have an engine. So let me ask you a question. What is 1 plus 1? Hopefully you gave me a pretty quick answer, right? Less than a second or two. But now, what about 5 times 5 plus 7? It probably took a little bit longer. Now, you know both these things, right? They're both very easy equations or expressions, but one of them required a little bit of thinking. And in the same way, if we talk about language learning, there will be words that you can tell me the meaning of right away. If I say hello in the language that you're learning, you're gonna right away be able to tell me what that means. But then there are other things that you know, but you have to think for a second and remind yourself of it. And then you can tell me what it means. And so this takes us to the fundamental problem of why most traditional language learning methods don't work. And it's because they don't acknowledge that there are levels of learning. So let's take word 1 here. Word 1 that you can tell me what it means right away, you probably have roughly this amount of it acquired, or all the way, right? You understand it inside and out, you understand all of it, right? All the context, etc. And you've heard it a bunch of times. Now word 2, you still know it. Right? If I ask you it, you can tell me what it means, but it takes a bit of time, and so maybe you only know roughly this amount of it. Let's say it's like 15% or something like that, 20%. Now the key difference here is that by the nature of how language works, it is something that is subconscious, right? When I speak to you right now, I'm not really thinking about what to say, I'm just saying stuff. In the same way, you're understanding me, but you're not sitting there and translating every word that I'm saying, right? You just understand it, because you've internalized this knowledge. So your goal should be to get to this level of knowledge in all words and for the whole language, right? And because of that, because language is a subconscious process that we don't use a bunch of thinking when we're gonna do, unlike math, right? With math, it's totally okay to think, even if it takes a couple seconds, because that's the nature of how it works. With language, that's not really the case. Even for advanced words, there are some advanced words where, yeah, you might not know it fully, but in general, with the language as a whole, you're able to tell me what stuff means and you're able to say stuff without thinking, right? And so because of that, your learning should reflect that on some level, and your learning cannot be in the same way that you're learning stuff like math. And so the solution to this is to, instead of trying to develop knowledge, you want to develop intuition. Okay? Now, this is a form of knowledge, I guess you could call it. It's more like implicit knowledge. So the difference is, if I'm telling you to tell me exactly the grammar rules that are associated with the sentences I'm saying right now, and tell me why I'm putting one word in front of another, that is conscious, explicit knowledge. While intuition is just what feels good, right? It's just what sounds good and what feels good. So if I say something right now, if say I something, you're gonna hear that it sounds weird, right? Because I'm putting the say in front of I. But when I say correct sentences, it just sounds totally normal, and that's intuition. So you developed this in English, probably, since you can understand this, but your goal should be to develop this in all languages that you're learning, and how you do that is via something called comprehensible input. So let's call it CI right here, comprehensible input. Now there is input, something you take in, that is comprehensible, aka that you understand. And this can also be referred to as something that is I plus 1. So it is your current level, I, plus something else, plus 1, which is a new unknown thing. So essentially, how this plays out in the real world is that instead of just doing these kinds of activities where you read from a textbook and you try to memorize a bunch of rules and really understand all the logic behind the language, you instead, via comprehensible input, develop intuition, which allows you to naturally understand language, and also express it, right? Now, when it comes to comprehensible input, this is really the only thing that can get into your brain fully. So let's say that this is your brain, it's a wrinkly little round thing. You're gonna have to excuse my drawing. this is really the only thing that's going to get into your brain fully, right? Studying like this is never going to be able to give you all the context necessary to truly acquire language and understand it on a deep level, which you really want to understand it on, right? Now, the reason that this comprehensible input is necessary to get fluent or to even get anywhere in a language realistically is because it's sort of like the engine in the car, right? No matter what you put into it, unless you have an engine, the car is just not going to start rolling by itself, right? It's not going to start going down the highway with just fuel in there. It needs an engine. And so this is because there are a bunch of different components of language that you need to understand, and you're not going to be able to understand them by just reading about them in a textbook because it's just simply too much, right? So for example, there are idioms. These are like phrases that we use commonly, and there are also collocation, right? Collocation is another thing that is very important to understand, and this is basically how words interact with each other. So for example, you say to pay attention. You don't say to give attention or to something else, right? But in Swedish, for example, you say to be attentioned or something like that. It doesn't have a direct translation. Okay, so you might be thinking that these are some solid arguments. You know, these things can be hard to learn from a textbook, but is listening and reading really the way to go? I mean, can we truly learn like children do as adults, and should we? And that's where I have a few questions to ask you. So my first question is, how do we hear stuff? Right? If we don't learn in the way that children do, because some people say that, they say like, oh yeah, well, children get fluent doing that, but adults can't, right? But how do we hear stuff? And I think that we all hear stuff, from my knowledge at least, through our ears. All right? We all see stuff through our eyes. We all digest food through our throats and then through our stomachs and, you know, through our intestines, etc. So why is it so far-fetched to say that we all learn languages in the same way? I really don't think that that's such an absurd statement, even though people make it seem to be. Now, am I saying that we should learn like children? Not necessarily, right? But I'm also not saying that we should throw everything out from the people that have gotten fluent, right? Like every single person who's currently speaking in the world have gotten there through comprehensible input, essentially, right? Just listening to stuff as a baby. Now, some people will say that, oh, well, it takes babies 5 or 6 years to get fluent. And it's like, sure, but it also takes them like 5 months to even say a single word, right? Not even a word, but like to make a sound. It takes them like a year to start speaking, but to even make a sound, to be like, it takes them like 5 months. I mean, do you think that it's gonna take me 5 months to say like we in French or whatever if I start studying it? No, of course not. And it's because they're children. So I think that's kind of an unfair comparison. But I think that what we can look at is how we can leverage our adult brains to speed up this process. And this is where I said that these things can get you to this position quicker than just input, right? So this is better than this. This will get you there as well, but this is a little bit quicker. So how can we leverage our brains to learn in the best possible way? So some people will say that input does work, but that it's just really, really slow. And that can be true. But I'd say that that's mostly true with most people's perspective, which is that input just means throwing on a random movie from like day one, right? So they're like, oh, bro, there's no way I can understand this. What, are you telling me that I can just watch something and then I'll magically be able to understand it after a while? It's like, no, like not necessarily. If you just hear a bunch of gibberish day in, day out, you're not gonna like advance magically. Not really quickly, at least. I mean, it's possible that you pick up like one word out of 10,000, but that's not really what I'm recommending. What I'm recommending instead is stuff like tailor-made content for your level, right? So if you're a complete beginner, let's take this scenario. If you're a complete beginner in, let's say, Swedish, right? And I try to teach you Swedish and I say, this is a head in Swedish, right? This is a head. This is an eye. This is another eye. He has 2 eyes. Like, this is not very difficult, right? It's just the most fun way to learn a language, not necessarily, which is why I think that you should probably start with a little bit of studying so you at least get that stuff down, right? But my point is that it doesn't have to be super complicated monologues about like rocket science or whatever. So what you can do instead is that you can search for your language, let's say Spanish comprehensible input on YouTube, and you'll find stuff in various levels, right? From complete beginners to advanced to intermediates, etc. And I'd also like to make the point that sure, it's gonna be slower with just pure input. You can technically learn more words quicker, I suppose, with just going through flashcards or an app. But the question there is that it's not going to be to the same level, right? So I'd say that you probably need less repetitions when it comes to input because you have so much context for every single word. You're going to need less repetitions to actually acquire a word than you would from just purely studying it, right? So that's one point. But the reality is just that like it is slow, and because of that reason, I think that doing some stuff like this can get your foot in the door and get it to this level, but ultimately you're gonna need a ton of exposure to the language and a ton of context to truly internalize stuff. And so just an example from my own life, I train Muay Thai or Thai kickboxing, right? And there have been times where I watch a video and I'm like, oh, that's a really cool move, like I'm gonna try that. Or someone says like, yeah, you should probably tweak this thing like this to make it better, right? Like if you kick like this, try kicking like that instead. And I'm like, all right, cool, let me try that. The difference there is that I hear those things and then I go into sparring the same day and I apply that and then I learn from what happened, right? Like I try it and I tweak it a little bit and I get some context. I see, okay, when I do this thing, the other person does this thing. And I get the context. And then maybe the next time I do it, someone else does, you know, this thing, etc., right? And so you get a bunch of different responses to the same thing, right? I'm not talking about speaking here in language learning context, but it's sort of the same thing. It's like, if you have gotten a baseline understanding of something, like this from a textbook, for example, you need to actually put it in practice and get more context around it to see how it can be used, right? Like I talk about here with this. So if you learn the word pay, you're not automatically gonna know that you say pay attention unless you actually hear that example being used, right? And so that's sort of my point here. I think that when it comes to stuff like sport, let's say even you do basketball or something, if someone tells you to like, oh, this is actually the way that you dribble the ball, and if you do it this way, it's going to be better, you don't automatically say, oh, now I know how to do it properly. You have to practice it first, right? You have to take the information and be like, that's a good tip, let me try that out. And then you try it in practice. But people don't seem to think of language learning that way, which is kind of baffling, right? When it comes to stuff like sports or driving a car, let's say, we all acknowledge that like actually doing the thing is what gets you better and it's like a necessary component. Of course you can get tips, but you have to sit behind the wheel and like drive to actually apply them. And there are certain things to where you can learn all the theory behind stuff, but like unless you've been in a few kind of weird situations when you're behind the wheel, you're not going to know how to respond to them, right? But then with language learning, it's like, oh no bro, you just have to review the card and see the direct translation 10 times and then you'll know it in every situation. It's like, no, that's not really how it works. So when it comes to some practical recommendations here, I'd say that roughly 80% of your learning should be input, right? Comprehensible input, whatever you want to call it. And 20% of your learning should be explicit studying. So these are some general numbers, very, very general numbers. And I think that for beginners can get away with 30, 50, even close to 100% explicit studying. You need at some point to switch your attention to input to really, like I said, internalize those things. But I do think that for beginners, there's a lot of value in just getting the basics down. And you can get them down a lot quicker, I think, from studying rather than just doing pure input as a beginner, right? These are maybe the first few months of learning. So, for example, in Japanese, there are a bunch of different particles. And we don't have particles in Swedish or English or Spanish, the language that I spoke prior. And so that's a totally new concept for me. So for me to just start inputting from day one without having any idea about these particles, you know, it might take a little bit of time for me to understand them. But if I were to just be explained that, hey, you know, Japanese is structured this way and they have a little bit of a different word order and they also have particles and some other things, I'll be like, okay, cool. And then I can pay attention to that in my input. So I think that for beginners, doing a bit more studying is fine and I would sort of recommend it. But at some point you get a transition into more input. Now, advanced learners will do close to 100% input. And that is because I think that the only real value that you have from explicit studying as an advanced learner is for stuff like specific pronunciation or perhaps a few very advanced words, right? If you want to learn, like if you want to specifically learn more vocabulary for whatever reason, you want to write a complex book about a topic or something like that, well then of course, yeah, you might want to learn a few words specific to that niche or something like that. But in general, you know, more input, the more advanced you get is really the way that you want to go. Now with this study, the 20% study, I'd say most of it should be on vocabulary. And it's because vocab generally takes more time than learning the basic grammar, right? Because there are so many words that you have to know to get to a basic fluency level. It's probably like 5,000 to 10,000 words. So studying via some sort of like a flashcard app is probably a good bet here. And in the beginning, getting frequency lists of the most common words, you can ask ChatGPT or just Google it or whatever, like the most common 1,000 words or something like that, and putting that into a flashcard or maybe downloading a deck, pre-made deck, that's really a good option here. And that's what I would do if I started learning a new language as well. Then, maybe let's say 5% of this 20% can be grammar. Just getting the basics of grammar, being like, okay, does this language have a different word order? How do they conjugate stuff? Like in Japanese, there's no such thing as plural, right? So if I were to start learning a language and I didn't know that, well, I might be looking for the plural without there even being one. So that's just good foundational knowledge to have, right? Okay, so you want to study a little bit of vocabulary and grammar and mostly input. But what about speaking? That's probably what a lot of you are asking yourself right now, which is fair, because we've been told that we need to speak a ton to get good at a language, right? Well, I believe that after a lot of input, speaking skills will naturally emerge. And why I came to that conclusion is because what is speaking really made up out of? It's made out of vocabulary, what people say, right? The things that people say. It's made out of how they structure that within a sentence to make it grammatically correct, right? Grammar. And it's also made up on how they say it, right? Their pronunciation, how they make it sound, how they can differentiate from one word to another. It's how they pronounce it. And so all of these three things, you acquire them all through input. You can do a bit of studying, but you can acquire them through input, right? And so because of that, essentially, and when I refer to input here, I'm just going to say like studying in general, right? So input and this explicit studying. But when you do these things in general, you will acquire all of these three things. And because of that, when you've done this for, let's say, 10,000 hours, of course you'll be able to speak naturally. There's no way that you do this for a ton of time and then you won't be able to speak. Because how else would you start speaking? I mean, speaking has to come from learning stuff in some way. Now, if you want to argue that you should start speaking earlier or later, that's a different story. But with enough time of doing this, you will be able to speak. Now, I think that for beginners, it does not make a lot of sense to just start speaking right away. And that's because if all I'm able to say is like, hello, my name is Buster, how are you, nice to meet you, and they're like, oh, I'm good, nice to meet you, and then I walk away and I'm like, okay, and then I go on to the next person, like, how much is that really gonna get me? Well, not much, right? I need to be able to have the knowledge to continue that conversation, to actually acquire new language from it, because otherwise it's just gonna stop there and I'm standing there like, okay, bye-bye. Like, it's not very productive. So I think it's better off, like you're better off as a beginner listening to other people having that conversation and then hearing them continue on talking about different topics, so you then can acquire more stuff to be able to use when it's time for you to speak. But I do think that for intermediate learners and advanced learners, speaking is very beneficial because it both gets you very good comprehensible input, right? Because you're talking about a topic that presumably you're interested in since you're speaking about it, and it also gets you the ability to be corrected, right? So it gets you comprehensible input and it gets you correction. These are two things that are quite valuable. Now, I don't think you acquire language from correction, but it's still beneficial, right? You can ask someone like, oh, how do you say this thing? And then you get reminded of it, and it's sort of like studying in vocabulary through a flashcard or something like that, right? And so, yeah, you learn speaking from input, but you refine it and you get good at speaking. You learn the basics from input, but you get good at speaking from speaking. But essentially, this is my recommendation. Study a bit, study more as a beginner, study less when you get more advanced. Do most of your stuff with good, comprehensible input that's also interesting to you. So don't just watch a random video, watch something that you're interested in. Do that enough, and after time you will be able to speak, and when you can speak to a basic level, then it's time to start speaking more and more to develop that skill even more, and then congrats. You are fluent. Now, if you want some personalized one-on-one advice and help to reach your language learning goals, then click the first link in the description. And if you want to learn the 5 things you need to do to learn language in 2025, check out the video on the screen. I'll see you guys there. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep learning.